I would like the subcommittee to come to order, and the chair would recognize himself for an opening statement. This morning, we're going to begin the markup of the Ratepayer Protection Act, a bill that will add several important safeguards to EPA's proposed clean power plan for existing electric generation. Now, we've had 6 hearings that relate to this issue, and we've heard from a lot of legal experts, and obviously there are different views on the legality of this clean energy plan. But I must say the disagreement has been pretty ferocious, and many people view this as an unprecedented action by EPA. We've heard from state officials who've been warning that the rule's accelerated deadlines are not workable for many of them and will create significant issues for them. We've heard from entities like Seminole Electric down in Florida about the loss of assets after spending billions of dollars modernizing their equipment to now find that they're going to lose these assets. We've heard spokesmen for ratepayers concerned about increased electric rates and reliability problems. I think NERC today came out with another report expressing concern about possible reliability issues because the administration is moving so quickly. As you know, when they finalize this rule, they're only giving states 13 months to submit their state implementation plan. Frequently, they have up to 3 years to do that. Now, if they do multi-state, they can get a couple years extension, but we have the states on a very short time frame here. So our bill basically, because of the controversy on the legality, basically says the states do not have to comply or submit an implementation plan until the courts have exhausted, the ratepayers and others have exhausted their remedies in the court system. Then the timeline would kick in. And we also say to the state governors, many of them have talked to us, many of them have filed suits, many of them are going to file suits once the rule becomes final, that if they show that rates and reliability would be significantly and adversely affected by this rule, then they can take action to delay implementation and continue to work with the EPA on that. And I don't know, many of you may have seen how China recently has developed the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank. The Obama administration tried to prevent countries from joining in. 57 countries have now joined into this bank. And one of the reasons the bank is being formed, but not the only reason, is because the administration, the Obama administration, working with Jim Yong Kim, the president of the World Bank, have told the developing world that they're not going to be financing any coal-fired plants, which really has been unheard of in developing countries. And the developing countries are saying, you know, we have millions of people that do not have access to any electricity or clean water, and we view this as more important to us than climate change. And yet the World Bank and these other Asian Development Bank and others are not providing any financing. So this China Investment and Infrastructure Bank, they're going to start financing coal-fired plants in the developing countries. And many of you may have read just a couple of days ago where they reached an agreement in Pakistan. And they're going to put up $38 billion to build roughly 6,000 megawatts of new coal-generating plants in Pakistan. And then they also are having discussions with the Indian government. And in India, they're talking about developing 455 new coal-generating plants. So we find ourselves in a dichotomy of we have the USA that's basically saying we're going to shut down coal plants, we have the developing areas of the world and other countries wanting to build coal-powered plants. So that's why many of us view this energy plan by EPA and by the President as being extreme, and that's why I think this common sense legislation provides additional protections and slows down the rush for a while. And with that, this time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for his 5-minute opening statement.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this markup. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to wish most of you here a happy Earth Day. And to the others, the round Earth doubters and the flat Earth advocates, you know who you are. Even after all these many hundreds of years, I still would like to wish you all a happy Flat Earth Day. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, as most of the world celebrates the 45th annual Earth Day, today we are here marking up a bill that will undo much of the progress that the Obama administration has put forward to actually help mitigate some of the disastrous effects of climate change and help put our planet on a more sustainable path moving forward. Mr. Chairman, as both ranking member of this subcommittee and as well as a co-chair of the Joint Bicameral Task Force on Climate Change, I'm proud to support the efforts that the Obama administration has initiated on both the international and the domestic fronts to try and address the worst impacts of this serious threat to Mother Earth. From establishing the Climate Action Plan, including the joint announcement with China establishing ambitious carbon pollution reduction targets, to making a national commitment to the Green Climate Fund, up to and including putting forth the Clean Power Plan, I applaud the leadership that President Obama has demonstrated in the face of inaction by Congress on this critical issue. And Mr. Chairman, why is it so important that we act to address this issue? Well, Mr. Chairman, the overwhelming majority of the world's scientists, climatologists, and most noted experts are all telling us the very same thing. Climate change is real, and we must act now before it is too late and too costly to do something about it. From severe wildfires in the West to more frequent flooding in the Midwest to sea level rise and greater storm damage along our coast, climate change has already taken a huge toll on our nation to the tune of billions of dollars in costs due to water shortages, drought, livestock losses, damaged property, and serious and tremendous health impacts. Mr. Chairman, for the sake of our own children and our own grandchildren, as well as for the health and welfare of our planet as a whole, this round planet, Mother Earth, we cannot simply choose to put our collective heads in the sand. Instead of fighting President Obama's efforts to address what may be, in fact, the greatest threat to that our country faces, Congress and this subcommittee should be supporting him, partnering with him, applauding him, and we should do our part to address climate change and lead our nation down the path of sustainability. So unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, here we are on Earth Day doing exactly the opposite of what the world is doing. They are proclaiming Mother Earth, and they are indeed recognizing our obligation to protect our environment. We're here today on this bill, and Mr. Chairman, I must urge all my colleagues to oppose this bill before us and let us get to work on real bipartisan legislation to move our country forward in the right direction, even on this, the 45th anniversary of Earth Day. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Rush, I want to thank you for reminding us it was Earth Day. We appreciate that very much, and thank you for your comments. At this time, are there any members on our side? Mr. Latta is recognized for a 3-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, and thanks for today for holding this markup. I have great concerns about the EPA's proposed Clean Power Plan, and I'm glad we are here to consider the Ratepayer Protection Act. Many states, including my state of Ohio, believe that there are legal challenges to the Clean Power Plan. I'm glad that this bill allows for the completion of judicial review on the final rules before states would have to comply. Additionally, it is expected that the final rule will have a very short timeline for submitting a state implementation plan. The cost of challenging the rule in court while simultaneously rushing to comply with the rule will further strain state budgets. An accelerated timeline to comply also leads to concerns about grid reliability. If plants are shut down in order to comply with the final rule, but new infrastructure, including generation, transmission, and distribution, is not up and running, reliability issues will affect the entire country. Affordable and reliable power is vital to Ohio's economic development. For years, Ohio's jobs have come because of an abundance of low electric rates, which is especially important for much of the energy-intensive manufacturing found in my district. Looking at this proposed regulation, the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio predicted wholesale market energy prices will increase 39% in the year 2025, costing Ohioans approximately $2.5 billion. This major cost increase does not even take into account things like the significant investments in upgrading the transmission system that are needed. I'm pleased that the bill would give the governor of each state the ability to not implement a specific state or federal plan if the plan would adversely affect ratepayers' reliability. The Clean Power Plan is a misguided proposal by the EPA. Look forward to advancing this legislation to protect the ratepayers in Ohio. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and we mistakenly gave you 5 minutes instead of 3, but you were well within the time limit, so thank you. Are there any? The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, for a 3-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I must say, regrettably, that I'm disheartened that we're marking up a bill like this today. Global warming is progressing. It's getting worse. We're already committed to significant change, encouraging more coal-fired and other carbon-producing sources is just going to make it worse. And there's a couple things we could do. We could go with carbon sequestration, but Republicans have very adamantly opposed carbon sequestration. We could gradually reduce the most polluting forms of energy, and now we're seeing that you're going to adamantly oppose that. So I think we need to rethink where we're going with this. I know my friend from West Virginia has said that, geez, we're only putting 4% of the carbon emissions in the country, in the world, but you know, there's a delicate balance that's existed for millions of years in the carbon cycle, and putting 30 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every year is upsetting that balance. Carbon is accumulating in the atmosphere. It's changing the climate. We need to face this, and we're not going to face it by putting our heads in the sand. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm sad to say that I regret this action today. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Thank you very much. Anyone seek recognition on our side of the aisle? The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would have to say that this particular bill is not about the debate regarding global warming and what the United States should do. This is about making sure we follow the law. As you will recall, when Lawrence Tribe was in here, an environmental leader, a lawyer, though, who believes in the Constitution, said, while I agree with the goal of what this bill is trying to do, it doesn't follow the law, and you can't burn the Constitution in order to meet the goals that you want to meet. And that's what we're talking about. And the legal basis for this law is extremely weak. And I believe the EPA knows that. In fact, when you look at the evidence in this matter, you have a situation where the EPA in 1995 made an interpretation over the same dispute they now claim they have authority in which to regulate under, and came down on the other side. Now, that wasn't during a conservative Republican administration. That was during the Clinton administration. Further, in 2008, dealing with the Clean Air Mercury Rule, CAMERS, a court ruled in New Jersey that according in view of the plain text and structure of Section 112, referring to the Clean Air Act, we grant the petitions and vacate the delisting rule. This requires vacation of CAMERS regulations for both new and existing EGUs, electric generation units. EPA promulgated the CAMER regulations for existing EGUs under Section 111D, but under EPA's own interpretation of the section, it cannot be used to regulate sources listed under Section 112. EPA thus concedes that if EGUs remain listed under Section 112 as we hold, then the CAMER regulations for existing sources must fall. EPA appealed that case, but not on that ground. They conceded the point on which they now wish to regulate. And then again in 2011, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a note, footnote 7, in the American Electric Power versus Connecticut case said, there is an exception. EPA may not employ 111D, if existing stationary sources of the pollutant in question are regulated under the National Ambient Air Quality Standard Program, and includes some other sections, but also includes Section 112. So the bottom line is that the EPA knows they're on weak ground. So this bill is important because the law is weak and the threat is great. The State Corporation Commission of Virginia estimated that just one of our many power companies, Dominion Virginia Power, that it would cost them substantial money, between $5.5 and $6 billion. And they state, and I quote them, contrary to the claim that rates will go up but bills will go down, experience and costs in Virginia make it extremely unlikely that either electric rates or bills in Virginia will go down as a result of this proposed regulation. Mr. Chairman, the law for the EPA is weak. The threat to the states is great. This bill is a bill whose time is right and whose merit is great. I urge that we pass this bill forthwith. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Griffith. At this time, the chair will recognize the gentlelady from Florida for a 3-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, colleagues. This bill is unfortunately tailor-made for a do-nothing approach in the face of very serious impacts of the changing climate. If adopted, it will cause great harm to consumers. Do not be fooled by the title of the bill. In a state like my home, the state of Florida, unless the Congress meets the modern challenge of the changing climate, we are going to heap new costs onto taxpayers, not just in my state, but all across the country. And here are some of the huge costs we're looking at already. With the changing climate, it's causing saltwater intrusion into our drinking water supplies in the state of Florida. That's going to be very costly to prevent and ultimately replace. Stormwater infrastructure, often taken care of by local governments and paid through stormwater fees or property taxes, are going to increase because of flooding caused by changing climate. Our coastal resources, you know, in Florida and many other states, we rely on our beaches as the lifeblood of our economy. We're going to face additional erosion of our coastal communities, and we've got to begin to address those rising costs now. Look at the cost of flood insurance. Look at the debate we had over flood insurance in the last year. Property insurance rates are going to go up unless we meet this modern challenge. We have got to unleash American ingenuity to meet the modern challenge of the changing climate. Don't hamstring American entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurial spirit of Americans in the face of increased carbon pollution. Americans want us to stay true to the Clean Air Act, take on the challenge of the changing climate, and unfortunately this bill just shirks that duty. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And very briefly, since my name was invoked over the 4% rule that we've been talking about for the last 4 years over I do want to enter this discussion just for briefly. One of the things I'm curious about that I've not had an answer, Mr. Chairman, both from the EPA and the folks on the other side of the aisle, a very simplistic question that I've been waiting 4 years for an answer, and that is if you go back to the time of the last glaciation, when we had the Bering Strait, the land bridge that connected North America by land, it was because the ice age was pulling all that water. Well, we've lost the land bridge, and also there was an article the other day about the English Channel was not a sea, it was merely a river back during that period of time. I'm just curious, what happened to melt the glaciers back 15,000 years ago? Because I don't think we had too many power plants back then, and we didn't have SUVs running around the highway. So I'm just curious, was it possible that this was natural and cyclical? Because I believe that the climate change is occurring, but this approach that we've been using, the EPA has been using, attacking fossil fuels for the last 10 years, is misplaced. And that's why I'm excited about this particular legislation. But I'm still waiting for an answer from someone from the EPA. Why did the glaciers melt 15,000 years ago when there weren't people and there weren't coal-fired power plants and there weren't millions of automobiles on the highways? I'm still waiting for an answer. So I'm looking forward to this and the passage of this legislation. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition on anyone else have an opening? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you holding today's markup. As we all know, energy is a key basic building block for a healthy economy. A healthy economy is what we need to be able to improve the lives of hardworking American families and also to provide the revenues for our federal government so it can defend us and take care of its other basic responsibilities. ERCOT, who is the Texas grid operator, estimates that the EPA's Clean Net Power Plan will increase costs to Texans by up to 20% by the year 2020. And that's sort of the low range, apparently, because many have argued that the percentage is too low and the ultimate impact will be much worse. And again, this hurts hardworking American families, particularly those at the lower end of the economic scale. The EPA's backdoor cap and tax regulation will have some of the most profound impacts on all sectors of the economy, and it threatens grid reliability. I strongly support Chairman Whitfield and our committee's efforts to protect consumers from rate hikes and to ensure access to affordable energy. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Is there anyone else seeking recognition for an opening statement? Seeing none, then that would conclude the opening statements. The chair will call up the committee print and ask the clerk to report.
Discussion drafts. To allow for judicial review of any final rule addressing carbon dioxide emissions from existing fossil fuel-fired electric utility generating units before requiring compliance with such rule, and to allow states to protect households and businesses from significant adverse effects on electricity ratepayers or reliability.
All right, without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there other amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
What purpose the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, Rush 01.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the discussion draft of the Ratepayer Protection Act of 2015, offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the bill before us, which I would prefer to call the Just Say No to the Clean Power Plant Act, would effectively give governors the power to opt out of federal requirements of the Clean Power Plan if they decide that complying with the plan will have an adverse effect on either the state's ratepayers or on the reliability of its electricity system. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, the language allowing a governor to opt out is ambiguous and does not take into account other costs that the states are already paying due to the impacts of climate change. So to address this issue, Mr. Chairman, I'm offering a straightforward amendment that simply says that a governor must certify that within his state any ratepayer increases associated with implementing a state or federal plan would be greater than any cost associated with responding to extreme weather events associated with human-caused climate change, taking into account any costs that would be necessary to adapt to or associated with increased sea level rise or flooding. Any costs that would be necessary to prepare for or are associated with more frequent and intense storms. Any costs that would be necessary to fight or are associated with more frequent and intense wildfires, and any costs that would be necessary to adapt to or are associated with increased drought. Mr. Chairman, as any state that has had to deal with the aftermath of any of these destructive extreme weather events can attest, Americans are already shouldering the costs of climate change, and these costs are getting worse. In fact, according to the National Climate Assessment, if we do not seriously invest in addressing climate change impacts now, we can expect to see more expensive and costly future damages affecting almost every facet of our society, from negative health impacts to stressing our infrastructure and our water systems, to harming our national security, up to and including hurting our overall long-term economic growth. Mr. Chairman, we know that these are not just idle threats, considering that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration just released a report stating that the globally average temperature over land and ocean surfaces for March 2015 was the highest for the month since record keeping began way back in 1880. Mr. Chairman, additionally, the same report shows that the first quarter of 2015, from January to March, also averaged record high temperatures all around the world. So, Mr. Chairman, with all these dire warnings coming from the world's foremost scientists, as well as from Mother Nature, we cannot allow governors to just say no to reducing harmful pollutants from their state simply because they might find acting to do so to be too burdensome. I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment to ensure that the governors are accounting for their failure to act to reduce harmful pollutants that impact the public good. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair will recognize himself to respond to the amendment. As was stated, the amendment would require a certification by state governors that costs to ratepayers under the EPA's Clean Power Plan would exceed the cost associated with responding to extreme weather events. Now, we know from testimony repeatedly by EPA about the Clean Power Plan that they did not think that this would have any significant impact on climate change. And Gina McCarthy made the comment that this is not about pollution control. Just last week, Acting Assistant Administrator McCabe indicated that EPA could not predict the impact of the rule on any of its climate indicators. So while I have great respect and admiration for my ranking member from Illinois, this amendment seems to be distracting from the real issue that we're trying to confront today, which are the complexities of EPA's pending rule, the legal and feasibility questions, and the real-world impacts on states, on ratepayers, and on our ability to be competitive in the global marketplace. So I would respectfully urge my colleagues to vote no on the Rush amendment. Is there anyone? The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to strike the last word in support of Mr. Rush's amendment, but I wanted to say in general that it's very disappointing to me that we're here on Earth Day marking up a bill that got EPA's Clean Power Plan proposal and effectively amending the Clean Air Act in a harmful and dangerous fashion. It used to be that even when Republicans spent significant time trying to undermine our environmental statutes, they would at least use Earth Day as a tool to trumpet some small consensus environmental bills with small improvements. And now we don't even get that. Now we have a Republican majority whose message seems to be Happy Earth Day, let's pollute the planet. As I said in last week's hearing, this legislation is not only dangerous, but also premature, unnecessary, and poorly conceived. It asks us to legislate to address phantom problems in a rule that has not yet been finalized, and it gives individual governors the unfettered ability to thumb their nose at the Clean Air Act. Human-induced climate change is real. It's happening now. Only the irresponsible can claim otherwise. But the purpose of this bill is to appease the climate deniers and give aid and comfort to those states who want to just say no to addressing unchecked carbon pollution from the largest sources in the United States. Yet the citizens of those states will not be able to just say no to the worsening effects of climate change such inaction would bring, from crippling drought to heat waves, from frequent extreme storms to damaging sea level rise. And those states, families, businesses, and others have no way to opt out of such fundamental changes to our planet's climate system. Last week, the D.C. Circuit heard oral arguments on legal challenges to EPA's proposed Clean Power Plan. Judge Thomas Griffith, a Republican appointee, noted that, quote, typically we're not in the business of guessing what the final rule would be like, and that by seeking review of a proposed rule, you're inviting us into a morass. Another Republican appointee, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, said that if the court ruled at this point, it would, quote, preclude the whole process that leads to a final rule. And Judge Kavanaugh also pointed out that, quote, you can't ask for a stay as soon as the final rule is out there. I agree that legal challenges to proposed rules are highly problematic, but what I find even more problematic is the notion that the Congress would also attempt to legislate away a proposed rule. Congress does not need to interfere when neither EPA nor the courts have had a chance to do their jobs. Litigants can and will challenge the final rule, and if necessary, the courts can use well-established judicial procedures to remedy the situation. Judge Griffith thinks that the Court of Appeals reviewing a proposed rule is a morass, yet it is exactly that morass into which the Whitfield bill would have us all jump head first. According to EPA, the passage of this bill would be disruptive. I think that's an understatement. This bill is both disruptive and unhelpful to those in the electric power sector who are trying to make the plans and long-term capital investments needed to ensure electric reliability and affordability well into the future. A serious effort would include working with states, regional entities, FERC, and electric generators to develop workable solutions to combat carbon pollution in a reasonable way. But it's clear that any serious effort is exactly what this bill seeks to stop. So finally, let me just emphasize that I believe this rule will be upheld in court. This rule is not a violation of the Constitution, nor is it the regulatory catastrophe that the doomsayers predict. On the other hand, this incredibly reckless, in my opinion, draft bill will provide an incentive for polluters to run out the clock on litigation, so all deadlines in the rule would be extended as long as possible, no matter how frivolous the challenge and regardless of the outcome. And efforts by my Republican colleagues to push states to just say no and refuse to cooperate with EPA and the requirements of the Clean Air Act, I think, set a really dangerous precedent, Mr. Chairman. So considering it's Earth Day, I strongly urge my colleagues to stop climate change obstructions. The Clean Power Plan will give us a reasonable path forward to reduce carbon pollution from the power sector. Just saying no without a backup plan is not only reckless, but it condemns our children and grandchildren to a world governed by the disastrous impacts of climate change. So not only I urge support for Mr. Rush's amendment and continue to urge opposition to the underlying bill. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, the gentleman previously speaking indicated that Judge Griffith indicated that there would be that they were trying to encourage the courts to get into a legal morass. The problem is the EPA has gotten us all into this morass, and the courts have an opportunity to act, but the rule has not yet been finalized, and that's what Judge Griffith was debating. Do we get into this mess before the rule is final? The gentleman said we should let the courts do their job. The problem is it will take 4 or 5 years for them to do their job, maybe 6, particularly if the current matter is set aside as not yet being ripe. We are facing a morass in many of the states, particularly I know about Virginia. As I stated before, the Virginia State Corporation Commission says just one of our electric power companies is going to spend $5 to $6 billion trying to deal with this. The dates the EPA has, remember I said it'll take 5 or 6 years for the court case to get through. One of those dates is that 13 months after they finalize it, sometime this summer, according to Janet McCabe when she was in testifying last week, 13 months later, the states have to come up with a plan. And by 2020, as it currently is understood, the states will have to start implementing that plan. That's a morass. And the courts are probably sitting there scratching their heads thinking to themselves, we are getting into this morass because of an EPA rule. Why doesn't Congress do their job and take action? This bill is an attempt to say, okay, the EPA is doing something that is totally unreasonable and, as I stated before, very weak on the law. So they're going to do something unreasonable. The least we can do, and is until that legal discussion is finished, is to give the states the ability to say, whoa, 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 this is going to create a morass for us. This is going to be a great threat for us. This is going to cost our ratepayers. You know, it's not just the big electric companies. So many people think it's just a big electric company pays these bills. No, they pass that on to the average citizen. And my people in the 9th District of Virginia cannot afford to have Washington sending more bills to them, putting them in harm's way, making it so that they're having to figure out how are they going to heat their homes in the wintertime. Are they going to have a small kerosene heater in one room to stay warm? I say no. I think the law is extremely weak. I think this rule will be stricken down. This regulation the EPA has proposed will be stricken down on the law itself. I don't think they have the authority to go forward. But what this bill says is that before we go and throw our ratepayers under the bus, 13 months to come up with a plan, 2020 for implementation, court case won't be decided until 2021, in my opinion, maybe 2022. Everybody will have already acted on this rule that does not have legal authority. Before we throw our citizens, the poor, hard-working men and women of the 9th Congressional District and all across the United States under that bus, let's give them some reprieve. Let's have Congress act. Let's say, whoa, if you think you have the authority, EPA, you go for it. That's your decision. But let's make sure that you have that authority before we harm the people who are having to pay their electric bills every month that are going up already because of EPA regulations and will go up tremendously if this regulation goes forward, particularly when we don't even know if it has legal authority. And I would submit it doesn't, but for those who do, why wouldn't you be willing to wait to find out? I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the Rush Amendment? Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. And speak in favor of this important Rush Amendment. The bill before us is the Climate Change Denial Bill. It is a disservice to America. It heaps cost on consumers. and it shirks our responsibility for addressing the costly impacts of the changing climate. The bill we're considering today shows that the Republicans' plan is to just say no, to let our children and grandchildren suffer the effects of climate change without doing something meaningful to protect them. Worse, the Republicans' plan is to stop any meaningful action to reduce harmful carbon pollution from the largest sources in the country. This position is indefensible, and it will prove very costly. Today's bill would essentially amend the Clean Air Act to give a free pass to states that refuse to comply with the requirements of the Clean Power Plan. Under the bill, governors can opt out if they determine that implementing carbon pollution requirements would adversely impact ratepayers in the narrow context as they define it. Making the argument that any possible costs associated with reducing carbon emissions to help stave off the worst effects of climate change is especially myopic. The world's leading scientists agree that warming temperatures that stem from human-caused climate change will contribute to more frequent and intense extreme weather events and wildfires, and they say that these trends will worsen as temperatures rise. Scientists tell us that the signs of climate change are already here, and I see it in my home state. That's not news to American families who are already dealing with climate change impacts. And it was good to hear President Obama in his weekly address say to all, there's no greater threat to our planet than the changing climate. The fact that the climate is changing has very serious implications for the way we live now. Stronger storms, deeper droughts, longer wildfire seasons. Just last year, the United States experienced 8 severe weather, flood, and drought events. Oftentimes, we're called upon to provide emergency aid. Let's factor those costs in. Those events just last year caused at least $1 billion in damage across 35 states. Overall, these disasters caused more than $19 billion in damage. And according to the Office of Management and Budget, over the past decade, extreme weather and fire alone have cost taxpayers $300 billion. And we're not even counting the everyday cost of the changing climate to the folks we represent back home. These events have cost Americans real money. These examples are just a snapshot of the overwhelming costs that we can expect in the future with exacerbated climate change. Mr. Rush's amendment would ensure that the cost of extreme weather events caused by climate change are taken into account under the bill. If a governor wishes to opt out of the carbon pollution reduction requirements of the Clean Power Plan, they can certify that the cost to taxpayers is far higher than any cost associated with extreme sea level rise, flooding, storms, wildfires, and drought. It's only logical to require a governor to consider all potential costs when making a determination in the underlying bill. You cannot and should not assume that just saying no to acting on climate will cost nothing. It's said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that's especially true for the costs of a rapidly changing climate. Our actions to reduce carbon pollution today will help avoid the cost of the future, a cost that we'll end up paying for catastrophic climate-related disasters. So I hope my colleagues will join me in recognizing that climate change is real, it's urgent, and I hope you make it clear that no plan and no action isn't an option. I urge a yes vote on the Rush Amendment and yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the Rush Amendment? If there's no further discussion, the vote will occur on the amendment. All those in favor of the Rush? Yes. The gentleman requests a roll call vote. Will the clerk call the roll?
Mr. Olson, Mr. Barton, Mr. Shimkus. No. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long.
No.
Mr. Long votes no. Ms. Elmers. Ms. Elmers votes no. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes no. Mr. Mullen. No. Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson. No. Mr. Hudson votes no. Chairman Upton. Chairman Upton votes no. Mr. Rush.
Aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Aye. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Chairman Whitfield.
No.
Chairman Whitfield votes no.
Is anyone else seeking to vote? The clerk will report the result. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 10 yeas and 16 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, Rush 02.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the discussion draft of the Ratepayer Protection Act of 2015, offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, instead of simply allowing governors to just say no to the Clean Power Plant Act willy-nilly, if they decide that complying with the plan would have select adverse effect on rates and reliability, I believe that it would make sense to have them take into account the cost of the health impacts associated with just saying no. Mr. Chairman, we all know that vulnerable populations, including children and the elderly, suffer disproportionately from higher levels of smog and pollution, and from longer and more severe heat waves. As the American Lung Association reports, Mr. Chairman, pollution from carbon emissions lead to climate change and threatens the public health by contributing to respiratory illnesses such as asthma attacks, and also can lead to heat strokes and to premature deaths. Mr. Chairman, my amendment simply states that a governor must certify that withdrawal from a state or federal implementation plan would not have a significant adverse effect on public health, taking into account avoided asthma attacks in children associated with implementing a plan, avoided heart attacks associated with implementing a plan, fewer hospital admissions associated with implementing the plan, and fewer missed school and work days associated with implementing a plan. Mr. Chairman, this issue is one that I am particularly sensitive to because my county, Cook County, is home to 113,276 children and 340,025 adults with asthma, according to the most recent reports. Given my city, the city of Chicago, the dubious distinction of having one of the highest asthma rates in the country. Additionally, Mr. Chairman, we all know that low-income communities and communities of color are more likely to be impacted by carbon pollution because power plants are more likely to be situated closer to these communities. So, Mr. Chairman, instead of risking the public health by allowing governors to just say no to the Clean Power Plan, let us offer a modicum of protection, some protection to the most vulnerable among us by adopting my amendment. Mr. Chairman, I urge all of my colleagues to support my amendment in order to hold governors accountable for their failure to act to reduce harmful pollutants that impact the public good. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Jimmy yields back balance of his time. The chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes to respond to the gentleman's amendment. As Mr. Rush said, this amendment would require certification by state governors that failure to implement a state or federal plan would not have a significant effect on public health. Really, the amendment is unnecessary because the bill already includes a provision that directs the state governors to consult with public health officials within their state regarding the impacts of a specific state or federal plan. Nothing in the bill affects any existing EPA regulation that seeks to protect public health. We've had 6 hearings and developed an extensive record on this proposed EPA regulation, and no one is talking about its impact on health. So I would respectfully request that members do not agree to the Rush amendment and would yield back the balance of my time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey to speak on the Rush amendment for a period of 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word in support of Mr. Rush's amendment. My Republican colleagues argue that this bill is needed to protect everyday Americans from the dangerous EPA rules, but that's not the case. This bill would block or needlessly delay EPA regulations on carbon pollution from power plants that are critical to protecting human health, the environment, and our climate. The legislation grants a blanket extension for all Clean Power Plan compliant states until all opportunities for legal challenges have been exhausted. And this unprecedented suspension of critical clean air regulations would occur regardless of a lawsuit's merits or likelihood of success. The bill also allows governors to opt out of the Clean Power Plan altogether, denying life-saving benefits to the residents of their states. So delaying or just saying no to the Clean Power Plan would have real-life, tangible impacts on human health and the environment in the United States. EPA estimates that in 2030, the Clean Power Plan will avoid up to 3,300 heart attacks, prevent 150,000 asthma attacks in children, lead to 2,800 fewer hospital admissions, and avert 490,000 missed work or school days per year. These benefits are worth an estimated $93 billion per year. And these are human health benefits that could be delayed or perhaps permanently lost if this bill takes effect. The health benefits potentially blocked by the bill are especially important for the most vulnerable among us, our babies, our kids, the seniors, and those with asthma. The Rush Amendment seeks to ensure that public health is considered when making a decision to ignore the requirements of the Clean Power Plan. If a governor wants to exempt his state from reducing harmful carbon pollution under the Clean Air Act, then he has to certify that doing so would not adversely impact public health. For decades, the Clean Air Act has saved lives by cleaning up dangerous air pollution. This bill would undermine the guarantee that makes the Clean Air Act work, and the assurance the EPA will step in to protect public health from pollution if a state cannot or will not do so. The bill before us sets a dangerous precedent by allowing any state to decide that meeting national clean air standards is merely optional, that the health and well-being of all Americans can be jeopardized by politics. I would hope that we could all agree that children shouldn't have to wait for the conclusion of frivolous lawsuits to be able to breathe clean air or play outside without being exposed to harmful pollutants. So I urge my colleagues to support the Rush Amendment and, again, oppose the underlying bill. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the Rush Amendment? Seeing none, the vote will occur on the amendment. All those in favor.
Mr. Chairman, I request a roll call vote.
The gentleman, Mr. Rush, requests a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Olson. Mr. Barton. No. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Shimkus. No. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith.
No.
Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Johnson.
No.
Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long.
No.
Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Flores. No. Mr. Flores votes no. Mr. Mullen. No. Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson. No. Mr. Hudson votes no. Chairman Upton. Chairman Upton votes no. Mr. Brush?
Aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Mr. McNerney?
Yes.
Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Aye. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. Capps? Ms. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle? Yes. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Castor? Mrs. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth? Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Pallone?
Aye.
Mr. Pallone votes aye. Chairman Whitfield?
No.
Chairman Whitfield votes no.
Does anyone seek to vote? Any additional votes? If not, the clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 10 ayes and 17 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. I guess it's AMD3.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the discussion draft of the Ratepayer Protection Act of 2015, offered by Mr. Pallone of New Jersey.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is identical to one recently offered by Senator Bennett and approved during the budget process. It's simple enough. It says, and I quote, the federal government should promote national security, economic growth, and public health by addressing human-induced climate change through the increased use of clean energy, energy efficiency, and reductions in carbon pollution. This is clear and concise language passed with the support of 7 Republican senators along with all the Democratic senators, and that group included staunch coal defenders like Senators Manchin and Heitkamp and Republican senators like Dean Heller, Mark Kirk, and Rob Portman. At a time like this, Mr. Chairman, it's best to quote Senator Manchin, who said, and I quote, "There is no question that climate change is real and that billions of people have impacted the world's climate. This amendment supports investment in clean energy technology, including advanced fossil energy, and supports energy efficiency, which reduces carbon and saves customers money. We can protect the environment for future generations while ensuring that we have affordable and reliable energy sources today." That's Senator Manchin's quote. Mr. Chairman, I have already stated my opposition to your legislation. I believe it is fundamentally flawed, and acceptance of this amendment isn't going to change that fact. But I guess you have the votes to pass this bill without my endorsement, so I think we should be clear about where members of this committee stand on the reality of human-induced climate change and whether or not it needs to be addressed. You, Mr. Chairman, have said that you are not a climate denier, and I believe you, so this should be a very easy vote. This amendment is a chance for members to stand up and be counted as someone who is not a climate denier and wants to do something about human-induced climate change. If that's your position, there should be no problem accepting this amendment. Of course, it wouldn't surprise me if some of my Republican colleagues oppose the amendment, because you are in the majority and that's your prerogative. But if you reject this amendment, then you will be counted as one who cannot affirm the simple fact that action on human-induced climate change is needed. And like Senator McConnell, you can be part of that Just Say No caucus. I know there are some Republicans who continue to dismiss the need to act on climate and deny the science, but hopefully there aren't too many who believe that. Again, it's the simple sense of the Congress. It doesn't change the substance of the bill, but I think it says a lot about where you stand on the issue of climate change. And so I yield back at this point, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back, and I want to thank the gentleman for offering the amendment. You know, we all are focused on this issue of climate change. And I think all of us remember quite clearly that when EPA testified on this clean energy plan, they all recognized that it was not going to really affect climate. The bill, the regulation would not affect climate. So, as I said earlier today, here we have China entering into an agreement and Pakistan to build 6,000 new megawatts of coal-fired plants. We have China negotiating with India to build 455 possible new coal-fired plants in India. We have this Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank being formed because they recognize that the World Bank, under the leadership of President Obama, is not going to provide money to developing countries to try to provide electricity to their people. And we know that lack of electricity affects economic growth. It also adversely affects health. So America does not have to take a back seat to anyone on addressing climate change. In fact, we're in the forefront of it. So the question becomes, in my mind, and I understand that people disagree with this, but if we're out there leading already, we're doing more than anyone else. And developing countries of the world are trying to develop economically and trying to generate electricity and provide for better jobs and health care and clean water for their people. For this administration to be taking the lead to prevent that, I do not think is wise. We have some of the cleanest coal technology in the world. As I've said earlier, we've had witness after witness talk about the effect on rates, the stranded costs that they have involved in these assets. Seminole Electric out of Florida made a big point on that. The state regulators are asking us, just give us a little bit more time. And when the Clean Air Act was adopted, I don't think anyone really thought, in fact, there were statements made that CO2 should not be regulated under the Clean Air Act. So with the Massachusetts decision on the car exhaust systems and the endangerment finding by EPA, we're now expanding this to all sectors of our society on CO2. And yet Congress has never spoken on it. So in this bill, we're not trying to repeal the act. We're simply saying, look, we know it's controversial. We know there's going to be lawsuits. Let's simply extend the time, let these lawsuits finish up. And then if some governors do find that it significantly adversely affects their rates and their reliability, then they can take some actions as well. So I'd be happy to yield.
You know, I appreciate your comments, but I have to say, you know, from the very first day when Gina McCarthy came in here, I think we had a hearing, you know, when she first announced the rule or the proposed rule, she just went out of her way to make clear that, you know, she was trying to be as flexible as possible, give states a considerable amount of time to comment on this. There were going to be all kinds of ways that they could meet standards. And again, that this is just a proposed rule, and, you know, they're going to take the comments and, you know, consider all these things before they finalize it. So I just don't understand why this legislation is necessary, because I disagree with you. I mean, if we really feel that we need time, we need flexibility, I think that the rule and the EPA's intentions are quite clear that that's what they have in mind. My fear is that, you know, that this bill basically denies all that and says, you know, even before we finalize the rule, we want to get rid of this thing, and we want to let, you know, governors have the ability to just say no, you know, as long as they keep suing. You know, I guess it bothers me, Mr. Chairman, because I know that historically, or at least since I've been here, you know, Republicans are always claiming that there's too much litigation and everybody's suing everybody too often. And I'm even, you know, I understand that, but it just seems like every opportunity, even before a rule is finalized, you know, the GOP wants to, you know, somehow protect the ability to constantly litigate and not do anything in the meantime. So I just, I can't agree with your analysis of what this bill is doing, particularly from the beginning when the EPA administrator came in here and made it quite clear that she was kind of bending over to do whatever she can to allow states flexibility. But whatever, I yield. Thanks.
We'll reclaim my time. I would just say that, yeah, EPA talks about flexibility, and yet they are dictating the caps for every single state. But then they say, and you can meet that cap any way that you want to. But under the rule, the mandatory goal set for each state would be fixed and could not be changed. So I guess, and let me just say this about the rule not being final yet. In my experience on these issues with the EPA, and we've looked at a lot of different rules, the only one that they changed in any significant way that my recollection was the cement rule. They had so much pressure that they did change it significantly from what they had originally. But other than that, what they've put out there is basically what they've ended up with. I see my time's expired. Does anyone else seek recognition to speak on?
Mr. Chairman, you'll say.
Well, I had my 5 minutes, so I'll recognize Ms. Capps seeks recognition to address the Pallone Amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do ask permission to strike the last word in support of the Pallone Amendment. And as the ranking member has said, this amendment would simply state that climate change is real and that we should work to address it, kind of a bottom line statement. I believe climate change is actually one of the most urgent and serious problems we face. Yet this underlying bill effectively prevents EPA from taking action to address it. The irony of this deeply flawed and misguided legislation being marked up today, which happens to be Earth Day, I think can't be ignored. For 45 years, Earth Day has been an opportunity for individuals around the planet to come together to place environmental concerns at the forefront of the collective global consciousness. It was actually first established largely in response to a devastating oil spill in my district offshore in 1969. But the message of Earth Day is just as relevant today. In fact, I believe it might be more so. It is a day to recognize that our actions do have consequences and that we must take responsibility for what we have done and what we are continuing to do to this planet. As policymakers, we do have a responsibility to create policies that advance the best interests of current and future generations, including when it comes to climate change. Scientists agree. Climate change is real. And not only is our climate changing, but human activities, particularly from the power sector, are contributing to this change. Temperature extremes are becoming more frequent, severe storms are becoming commonplace, oceans are becoming more acidic, and there is not enough water where we need it, and too much water where we don't want it. Beyond changes to our environment, climate change has implications for health, for food security, and the availability of clean water. Studies have shown that climate change can lead to higher rates of asthma, reduce crop yields, increase the risk for harmful algal blooms to poison our reservoirs. Clearly, climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is a social and economic issue as well. The impacts of climate change are disproportionately affecting individuals who can least afford to address them. It's already costing our economy billions of dollars in storm damage, flooding, harmful algal blooms, and much more. We owe it to future generations to start taking responsibility for our actions now and work to reduce the carbon emissions that are driving climate change. This Ratepayer Protection Act before us does not present a clear path forward and does not present any real solutions to the problems we face. Instead of working to determine the best course forward, this legislation would derail the Clean Power Plan before it's even finalized. Climate change is a time-sensitive issue. We cannot afford to keep saying that the solutions are too hard and leave a legacy of inaction. We do have a responsibility to our constituents to find solutions that help to mitigate the causes of climate change and adapt to impacts that we are seeing now and will certainly see in the future. We should be debating the merits of concrete actions to combat climate change, not simply endorsing inaction. So I urge my colleagues to support this basic Pallone Amendment and oppose the Ratepayer Protection Act. And I yield either to a colleague or yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. This time recognize the gentleman from West Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think I'll need all 5 minutes. There were just 2 points I wanted to raise. One is we keep hearing about asthma, and my son is asthmatic, and I'm obviously very sensitive to that issue. But in this particular rule that's been issued, if you've read the 130 pages, you'll find nothing in the rule that says that reducing the CO2 emissions is going to reduce asthma. There's nothing in the rule. Second point, and I think it gets down to try to put this thing into context. If in America we were to shut down every coal-fired power plant in America, every one of them, the United Nations statistics not a Republican think tank or a Democrat think tank from the United Nations, indicates that we would lower the CO2 emissions in the globe by 0.2%. That's it. 0.2%. If we stopped all coal-fired power plants in America, let alone just reduce them, 0.2%. And we're willing to try to and put our economy at risk in America that depends on low-cost energy for 0.2%. I think that's dangerous, and it's ill-conceived, and it's politically and ideologically driven rather than based on science. It's the United Nations statistics, 0.2%. That's why I'm supporting the bill. I yield back my time.
Chairman yields back. Mr. Doyle is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the gentleman's amendment, but I want to speak on the issue generally. I would just say to my Republican colleagues that we can't ignore the impact of rising CO2 levels. And I would say to my Democratic colleagues that we can't dismiss the fact that fossil fuels are going to be our major power source for decades to come. It just seems to me that for too many years here in Congress, this argument has been black or white. Either stop the use of fossil fuels tomorrow and face serious reliability, safety, and cost issues, or just ignore the science that exists that says our climate's getting warmer. We need a plan. I would say to my Republican friends, doing nothing is not a plan. And I would say to Democrats that for our constituents who haven't seen their paychecks go up in 15 years, we need a climate change plan that Americans can afford. You know, we've made a lot of headway into making all sources of energy more sustainable, but we need to do much more. I don't know what technologies we haven't yet discovered, but I do know that we have the best researchers and scientists in the world, and I know we're not doing enough in supporting that research. The Quadrennial Energy Report released by the administration yesterday highlights the lack of investment we've made into our nation's energy infrastructure. And I want to urge all my colleagues to pay great attention to this report. I strongly believe we need to help scientists find cleaner and better ways to make all sources of energy, fossil fuels included, cleaner, more reliable, and more affordable. So my question to all of you is, where is the investment? Where is the funding for research and development to make sure that we continue to have a balanced national energy plan that does truly rely on an all-of-the-above approach to provide affordable, reliable power, but in a cleaner and more sustainable way? Think about this, colleagues. Mr. McKinley's right. You could shut down every coal plant in the United States. You're not solving climate change. They're going to burn coal in China and India and all over this world. So what we should be doing? We should have our best and brightest minds. This should be the mission to Mars, to come up with a technology that helps us reduce carbon emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. And when we develop that technology, we can sell it to every other country in the world, and then you will start to address climate change. For Democrats or Republicans to sit here and do nothing for the next 40 years to make fossil fuels burn more efficiently and cleaner is to put a death sentence on future generations, not only in our country, in the world. And I would say to you today, I don't see a single bill or appropriation that is doing that. We have national labs in this country. We have entrepreneurs. We have scientists that could tackle this problem if we made it a national priority. I can't think of anything more important for the federal government to do. And let me tell you, folks, it's not going to happen in the private sector. The private sector is not going to fund this kind of basic research. Either we put our money where our mouth is and fund the basic research and say this is the mission to Mars. We want 5 demonstration projects over the next 5 years to come up with a technology that will help us reduce carbon emissions from fossil fuels. And then I think Americans can say that we're serious about wanting to do something for this problem. I don't see a serious plan from either party in this Congress, and it's time we put our money where our mouth is and just cut this endless discussion that I've been on this committee 15 years, and this is like Groundhog Day every time we talk about climate change here. It's the same old arguments on both sides. Let's put our money where our mouth is. Let's fund some research. Let's figure this out. Technology is the answer to every one of these things. Every source of power has risk. Whether it's solar, wind, nuclear, gas, oil, there's risk. The way we mitigate risk is through technology. This country has always been a leader in that. Let's develop the technology to save the entire world, and let's sell that technology and make a bunch of money in the process. But let's get to work and do it now. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Thank you. Are there any gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes?
And I'll be real brief. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleague from Pennsylvania. Is very impassioned, and he's seen passion on both sides. I would just for the newer members, the federal government tried to do that. We had a project funded by the federal government through the Department of Energy called FutureGen, in which President Bush stopped. And then we had a project, FutureGen 2.0, that President Obama just stopped. So it hasn't been a commitment by us in authorization or money, at least on that major one was gasification of coal and then carbon sequestration, and the other one was turning an old power plant into also gasification and then carbon sequestration. The executive branch on both parties has not had the will to see this project through. So, and I would yield to my colleague.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
well, you did.
Are you done? When you're done, I'll talk.
No, I'm done.
All right. No, I just wanted to. I really appreciate what Mr. Doyle said, because he's absolutely right. And regardless of what prior administrations have done, Democrat or Republican, the way Mr. Shimkus described, I really think we should, both sides should look at this 5-year plan, I guess, that Secretary of Energy put out yesterday, because it does actually make some great suggestions in terms of investment in infrastructure and energy infrastructure that could be, that could lead to legislative proposals. And I know that Chairman Upton, as well as Chairman Shimkus and our ranking member Bobby Rush have all talked about possibly putting together legislation. So I think that we should definitely take up what you're suggesting, Mr. Doyle, and regardless of what's been done in the past or not been done in the past, as Mr. Shimkus said, this is definitely something that we should be looking at for the committee to take some action.
I'll reclaim my time, then I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I'm moving to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized 5.
Mr. Chairman, I want to applaud my friend from Pennsylvania, his passion and his vision for the future of the nation. And I also want to just add a comment that Rodney King asked the question that Rodney King asked some years ago: why can't we all just get along? Mr. Chairman, I really support Ranking Member Pallone's amendment. That's the question at hand right now. And this Just Say No bill that is before us is nothing more than a way to block the EPA from implementing its clean power plan. The bill before us delays compliance for however long it takes to complete all litigation, no matter how frivolous the lawsuit, and even if all arguments against the plan are on the losing side. The bill then tells states they can simply opt out of the pollution reduction requirement of both a state plan and a federal plan anyway. All of that legal maneuvering is just a complicated way of giving states and their climate-denying governors an excuse to do nothing to control carbon pollution. Mr. Pallone's amendment is an opportunity for all members to affirm their belief in human-induced climate change and agree that the government should play a role in the reduction of carbon emissions, no matter what state they come from. And this is a simple statement of fact. And it should be a relatively easy vote. As been stated, we have debated similar amendments in the past, and unfortunately, my Republican colleagues have voted them down time and time and time again. And, Mr. Chairman, I hope that some of them, in light of the passion that's been expressed here today, that some of them might be willing to change their minds. The exact same language, Mr. Chairman, that is in the Pallone Amendment was approved by a majority of the Senate, including 7 Republican senators and pro-quo Democratic senators. Such support for anthropogenic climate change, affirming the language, is truly a sign of the times. In fact, a recent poll conducted by the New York Times, the Stanford University, and the Resources for the Future demonstrate that the current consensus view of climate change in America is such. 81% of Americans believe that climate change is caused by human activity. By party, 88% of Democrats, 83% of independents, and 71% of Republicans said that climate change was caused, at least in part, by human activities. 74% of Americans says that the federal government should be doing a substantial amount to combat climate change. By party, 91% of Democrats, 78% of independents, and 51% of Republicans said that the government should be fighting climate change. 83% of Americans, including 86% of independents and 61% of Republicans, said if nothing is done to reduce emissions, global warming will be very or somewhat serious for us as a problem in the future. Mr. Chairman, this bill is an invitation for states to do nothing to reduce harmful climate emissions. 6 out of 10 Republican citizens understand that if nothing is done to reduce global warming, there will be serious problems in the future. Enacting this bill will ensure that what our future would be. I urge all my colleagues, Mr. Chairman, to vote in favor of the Pallone Amendment. It should not be a hard vote. It's an easy vote for all of us who believe in taking action to fight human-induced climate change. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rush, and thank all of you for your discussion on this issue. And if there is no further discussion, the vote, the gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes.
Move to strike the last word in support of the Pallone Amendment. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to respond to one thing that my friend from West Virginia said, and that's when he cited the United Nations figures for the record so that there's no misconception of what the United Nations did. Last November, they issued a report saying that there was an urgent need to combat climate change and recommended a 30% worldwide reduction in carbon emissions. So the United Nations is very much on record as recognizing the problem of climate change and urging action in that regard. So I think the Pallone Amendment is a reflection of that same concern, and I urge its adoption. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. If there is no further discussion, the vote would occur on the Pallone. The gentleman asked for a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Olson. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Shimkus. No. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. No. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. McKinley. No. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo. No. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. No. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Johnson. No. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long?
No.
Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers? Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Flores? Mr. Flores votes no. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson? Mr. Hudson votes no. Chairman Upton? Chairman Upton votes no. Mr. Rush?
Aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Mr. McNerney? Aye. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Tonko?
Aye.
Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Engel?
Aye.
Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green? Aye. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. Capps? Ms. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth? Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Pallone? Aye. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Chairman Whitfield?
No.
Chairman Whitfield votes no.
Are there any other members who would like to cast a vote? If not, the clerk will report the result.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 12 ayes and 17 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question would now occur on forwarding the committee print to the full committee. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. No. We're not on tune here.
We want a roll call vote. That's why
the gentleman requests a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Olson? Mr. Barton? Aye. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Shimkus? Aye. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Pitts? Aye. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mr. Latta? Aye. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Harper? Aye. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. McKinley? Aye. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Pompeo? Aye. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith? Aye. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Aye. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long? Aye. Mr. Long votes aye. Mrs. Elmers? Mrs. Elmers votes aye. Mr. Flores? Aye. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Hudson? Aye. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Chairman Upton? Aye. Chairman Upton votes aye. Mr. Rush?
No.
Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Tonko? No. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Engel? No. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green? No. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Capps? Ms. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Yarmouth? Mr. Yarmouth votes no. Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack votes no. Mr. Pallone? No. Mr. Pallone votes no. Chairman Whitfield?
Aye.
Chairman Whitfield votes aye.
Mr. Mullen's here.
Mr. Mullen? Aye. Mr. Mullen votes aye.
Anyone else seek recognition for a vote? Seeing none, that would conclude the vote. The clerk will report the result.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 17 ayes and 12 nays.
The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the subcommittee today. So ordered, and without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.